Welcome, everyone. I'm Dave Orban from the product marketing team here at Superna. Welcome to part two of our discussion about defending against ransomware. If you saw part one, you'll recall that we took a high-level look at the current state of ransomware and some of the main challenges and obstacles that are faced by organizations of all shape and size. Today, we're going to be doing a little bit of a deeper dive and taking a look at ways to meet the challenge of defending against ransomware and securing data in the hybrid cloud. First, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. We are recording this webinar, and both the recording and the slides will be made available after the event. Due to the number of folks on the call, your mics have all been muted, and any questions that you might have should be directed via the Q&A mechanism. We've got a lot to cover during the next 45 minutes or so, and if we don't get to your questions during the webinar, rest assured that we'll be happy to reach out to you on an individual basis following today's event. So our speakers today in this panel, well, first off, Alex Hesterberg, Superna's CEO. He was originally scheduled to speak, but he is currently over in Thailand, I think, or Singapore, one of those places, at a conference and is unable to participate, so I'll be his stunt double for today. We've got Kyle Francham, who is Superna's VP of R&D, and Tom Tasker, who is a Senior Storage Solution Architect for Global Financial Services Practice at AWS. So, well, actually, let me go back there. What we're going to be talking about today, where are you here, kids? We're going to cover a couple of things today. The first is the prevalence of new and emergent threats and the pace of innovation that's required to address them, how customers are engaging AWS to help deal with those threats, and how Superna and AWS work together to help mitigate those threats. There'll also be an overview of AWS storage services, and immutability, and then we'll talk about some of the challenges posed by hybrid environments. And then obviously there will be Q&A at the end. So the way we look at things here at Superna is we look at, cyber is the new face of disaster. But, the days of, hurricanes and tornadoes and floods and even hardware failure, that's all kind of in the past now. And cybercrime is really the new face of the disaster. And from our perspective, at least, prevention is the new recovery. It's a lot easier and less costly to arrange for prevention, early detection prevention, than it is to initiate a recovery. Businesses are producing and relying more and more on unstructured data. That's another aspect that we'll talk about. Just in financial services alone, that could include things like financial records, text and chat, social media, images, video, multimedia, research, even surveillance media, intellectual property, and more. And all of these elements make up the most important components of unstructured data. And if they're not in some on-prem file system or an object storage platform, they might actually be unprotected. The varied nature of unstructured data itself means that it's difficult to analyze, difficult to audit. It's frequently in motion because of collaboration, and it's become increasingly attractive to cyber criminals, which is why we're here. Over the last couple of years, Superna has been helping customers to deploy a data-centric security strategy that can detect when any data, both on-prem and in the cloud, is at risk or has come under some form of attack, whether it's ransomware or exfiltration, whatever. We actually detect it as it's happening instead of trying to figure out how to recover from it weeks or maybe even months later. Again, prevention is the new recovery. That experience, both on-prem and in the hybrid cloud, is what brought us into the partnership with AWS. And of course, so many of our mutual customers, they're already leveraging AWS today. So we thought we'd put our minds together from an R&D perspective to better understand how we can leverage the AWS footprint to solve for and mitigate these ubiquitous and continually evolving cyber threats. As we know, there's no shortage of risks today. Every example you see on screen here involves unstructured data that has been either encrypted or exfiltrated or otherwise compromised in some way as a direct result of an attack. And in all cases, they were not running security at the data layer, which is one of the things that differentiates Superna and is crucial to our partnership with AWS. It makes it's different how it's typically approached. Threats never sleep. We know that, right? When we talk about cybersecurity, we're really talking about data security, the ability for the platform to automatically detect a threat, to take immediate action. And with the AWS partnership, we've been able to stitch together that ability into AWS itself and provide not only a method for immediate detection and seamless recovery. And just to reiterate, cyber threats, they don't sleep. This is just a couple of notices from last week that have cropped up. The hits just keep on coming, and they're not going to be slowing down anytime soon. When we talk about the challenge of ransomware and cyber threats, again, the way we approach it is to identify a threat itself, to discover it, to eliminate it, to alert on it, to trigger a workflow for immediate remediation. Not only is this important from a business continuity standpoint, but it also impacts your cyber insurance. Just in the last year, premiums have skyrocketed by more than 50% year over year, if you can even obtain a policy. And this is why having in place a platform to detect and remediate can be the difference that allows you to even secure cyber insurance in 2023. Now we're going to turn it over to Tom, and Tom's going to talk a little bit about how customers are currently engaging with AWS to deal with these kinds of challenges. Tom?
Brilliant. Thanks, David. Can I just check audio coming through okay? Yeah, all good? Super. Thank you very much. Yeah, so how are customers engaging with AWS to deal with these threats? So as you kind of mentioned at the start, I'm very much focused on the global financial services space. And as you can imagine, if you go and look at any of the reports and you go and have a look at the verticals, the business groups where cyber threats are, or cyber attacks, I beg your pardon, are taking place, financial services is usually up there as one of the kind of top verticals, the top elements for where the bad people are aiming their attacks. And in terms then of what we're seeing for conversations with customers is that we're having discussions around really the why and the how. So there's this kind of assumption that we have data, we need something to protect it, and it's going to end up somewhere protected. And we're kind of happy with that in terms of an overall plan. It doesn't matter who you're going to use, where it's going to land, or what it's going to do. That's the job of our partners and storage partners and technology companies all across the place. But the conversations we're having are really kind of like, why do we want to do this, David? And you touched upon it already, which is one of those reasons is actually getting insurance for an organization, the cyber insurance piece, or just insurance as a whole, could become difficult for companies that do not have proper strategy against the cyber event. I mean, there was a quote, I think, just at the tail end of last year from the CEO of Zurich, who said that cyber event insurance could almost be something that if you do not have a demonstrable plan of how to recover from an operational environment, your operational environment from an attack, could make you uninsurable. And that's the CEO of Zurich. So we're starting to just see also as well, these kind of outside influences coming in from all kinds of attackers. And the way that to kind of think of it, regardless of the cloud almost, if you were to go and build a data center, on a flood, in a floodplain, on a fault zone without a fire suppression system, and you said, can I have some buildings insurance? Your insurance companies are going to kind of look at you and say, yeah, I think we need to have a discussion about how you've gone away and done that. And I think we're getting now that variant of conversation with customers around, we know why we need this, but actually, how are we going to go about this? How are we going to start? What are the things we need to take into consideration? And that's really kind of where myself and the kind of the storage DFS team are having those conversations. So almost less about the AWS services, if you will, but more looking at the starting points of what needs to be vaulted, what does recovery look like, how is this going to roll into people and processes, how do we manage these things? And that's kind of really where we are and what we're doing in this space at the moment.
Kyle, can you give us a little color on how Superna and AWS are working together to mitigate these threats?
Yeah, and like, thanks, Tom. I think that analogy of proposing to build on a floodplain is a really good one. I think that you can extend that to, say like anywhere that you build, even if you're not on a floodplain, right? You still need to understand the threats that are local to your relevant environment, right? And if you take that metaphor a little bit further, the threats of a floodplain are going to be different than the threats if you're underneath an avalanche path, right? But similar, and you need protection. Same with on-prem and AWS, right? Superna and AWS have worked together to kind of come up with a consolidated view of what it means to protect data, right? Superna has a really long history. We have real world experience protecting data on-prem. And where that data exists, the tools and techniques that you use to understand threats and analyze what's happening to that data are not the same, but are similar, right? The thing that really helps with an AWS type environment is AWS has such a rich library of all the building blocks that you would need to put together a really advanced cloud first, AWS native defense solution. And that involves combining not all of them, but many of the different services that AWS offers. All of them would be an incredible. Like there's a lot of things in AWS, right? But combining different building blocks from AWS. And as we're forced to make decisions on how are we going to solve problems, how are we going to answer things, for us as an entity or as a company who are helping to protect customers, it really gives us a good leg up, right? There's always the use versus build conversation, and AWS provides us with the building blocks and the tools and the partnership in order to be able to craft like a really first class data protection solution that's built on AWS's experience with running software at scale, Superna's experience with running software at scale, and Superna's experience with protecting data wherever that data may live. As different threats emerge, obviously we have to stay current with those threats, right? And this is where, being in constant conversation with the industry, with AWS, with customers, with security researchers on what those threats look like, how they're changing, how they're, being implemented in the environment, and just understanding how we predict what threats are critical now, what threats are critical down the road, and the different classes and categories of threats to a customer's data that we might see.
Can you talk a little bit about encryption and the data-centric approach that we take here at Superna?
Yeah, so Superna has as you said, a very data-centric approach for detecting encryption. And I like to highlight this. There's a million ways for malware to get into a customer's environment. Sometimes that's, a phishing attack, right? Click on this site and track your package. Well, you're not really tracking a package, you're downloading a malicious binary. Sometimes it's through different social engineering methods, right? And the various ways that you see that happen, there's almost, you should be protecting yourself against that, right? Obviously, corporations need training for their staff against phishing, but we know that that's not perfect, right? However that malware gets in, or however that exposure gets in, there's only a limited number of ways to actually encrypt the data. So if we're talking here true ransomware, right? And I want to highlight that as one subclass of category that Superna focuses on. Our threat protection is much broader and much wider actually than just straight ransomware. But if we're talking about ransomware protection in general, the characteristics of a ransomware attack are, I have a piece of data, right? Maybe on-prem that's a file, but in the context of AWS, we're talking about often an object. Customers have huge S3 data stores, right? That have objects in them. You have an object, that object must be encrypted in a certain way and then written back in a way that it can't be decrypted by the end user. So typically on object, what that means, right? You would have to read, some or all of the object. You'd have to encrypt it in a certain way with a private key that's known only to the attacker. And then you would write that back. And you do that in a way that's destructive to the previous versions of the object on the bucket. No matter how you actually get compromised or how an end user gets compromised, whether it's a USB key that you pick up out of the parking lot or some AWS credentials that unfortunately are mishandled and leaked, once that happens, that attack pattern is very, very similar. So we take the approach of looking for those particular attack patterns. I want to highlight too that there are some attack patterns that are native only to object store and things like AWS. There is, if you Google for it, you can find this. You can find GitHub repositories that will have sample code for replacing an AWS key, right? Your KMS keys, and you can have a KMS-based attack on object storage. Now, obviously, enterprises need first-grade storage and first-grade protection of their keys. We all know that that's not perfect, right? And so, no matter what, you actually need protection against those mechanisms. These, ransomware type code you can find takes a different step. If you think about that first data-centric one that I'm highlighting, right, that involves actually exporting data out of S3 and then encrypting it and then sending it back. If you're using a KMS type attack, actually that is, you set the encryption on the bucket and then, the S3 service itself will do what it's supposed to do and encrypt all the data. However, if you are in control of the key or if an attacker is in control of the key, then you've lost access to the encryption of your actual objects. And that can be problematic. To that end, we do have an AWS first architecture, right? And this is a little bit about, what I was talking about before. Getting this data out of a bucket is, I don't want to say it's super challenging. It's something that, you can follow the documentation on AWS to figure out how to do it. And Amazon obviously provides us as Superna with a lot of support and development assistance to understand what the best practices are here. But if you look at how an actual data flow goes, there's objects that are happening on this bucket all the time, right? Reads, writes, lists, delete, modify, and those all get put into SQS topics. From the SQS topics, then, we inhale those into our own Superna software stack. They get put into a managed Kafka queue so that we can operate on them as we need to. And then our software layer splits them up by end user and filters them down. And on a per user basis, we can tell exactly what a different user is doing. User being typically an IAM user in AWS. And so with those different users, we build out profiles of exactly how those users are interacting with the bucket storage. And if there is activity that's indicative of ransomware, for example, right, we see list, we see get, we see read, we see write, and then delete. If that happens once, that's a normal operation. If that happens over and over and over again from a user that doesn't typically do that operation, that's indicative that the bucket has been compromised. And then we can take action and actually stop that user from doing the task that they're currently doing. This is done through integration with, roles and IAM permissions and access key permissions on AWS. So we can understand the behavior. And as that behavior continues to proceed, actually our software will have an escalated response where the ultimate endpoint of that is locking out a user from their current action.
Before we move on to Tom again, who's going to talk about how how it works with AWS storage services and general immutability issues, I want to take a minute here and do a little poll here. Just a couple of questions that I would love to be able to get some feedback from the audience here. So I'll give you a minute or so to go through these. There's basically three questions. One is, how much data are you currently storing in the cloud? One is, what percentage of your stored data is unstructured? And the last question is, which cloud platforms does your organization currently utilize? That's a multiple choice question. So if everybody can take a minute or two to do that, and then we will move on. All righty, Tom, back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David. So just kind of building on some of the stuff that Kyle said as well. We absolutely appreciate that, things are going to happen that we don't plan for, and we absolutely understand this. And and if it happens in a malicious way, then we have a lot of work to try and do to get that back. And just to kind of go back to my opening spiel, this is why when we're talking to customers initially, we really want to focus on, we're really focusing on that how element. How do we get things back? How do we plan for the kind of worst case scenarios? And that's not because we want to take this to kind of extreme examples, or we want to spread any fear, uncertainty, or doubt. Far from it. What we actually want to do is have that conversation where we absolutely understand what a true recovery looks like. And one of the examples that we use is, and again, there's kind of loads of terms knocking about. Some people have their favorites. Some people kind of cringe when they kind of hear these, whether it's extinction level events, whether it's ground zero planning, whatever it might be. And part of that is to say, look, you've lost everything in terms of your operational environment. It's all just gone. So, but we have an out, right? Because if we don't have an out, then there's nothing to recover, and we might as well just end the conversation. Now everyone can get kind of pack their bags and go home. So we want to make sure that actually that out is at the most protected, is the most secure, is essentially the Fort Knox, if you will, where the golden copy of the data, that mission kind of critical copy of your organization is absolutely stored. So what we try and do, again, when we talk about that how element, is how can some of the AWS services come into play for that piece? And we've got here, this AWS storage services and immutability, and I'll just kind of look at the, kind of go with the services first, which is where if you take S3, so the Amazon Simple Storage Service, again, exactly to Carl's point, tons of documentation out there, not just on the AWS website, but also from kind of other commentators in the industry. S3 is capable of ingesting petabytes, even exabytes of data. It is an absolutely brilliant storage service, depending on who you speak to, of course. But it comes with a bunch of features as well. So it's not just, we don't just want customers to dump data into AWS, put some security around it and think kind of job done. And we don't expect any kind of customer to think, in those kind of terms, because actually what we want to do is we want to take advantage of some of the features that we have inside of that as well. And essentially one of the easiest ones, one of the quickest ones almost to get started, is to turn on that object versioning. So to Carl's point, as he mentioned previously, bad things happen, hopefully, if you can hope for anything, by mistake, which is just, you fat fingered a security principle, or, you've just accidentally left something unlocked. There's no malicious intent behind it, is essentially what I'm getting at. But by having versioning installed on that, if you do have some kind of situation where the active copy of the data becomes encrypted or deleted, what versioning allows you to do is essentially roll that data back to before that happened. So even though your kind of top layer may be totally encrypted and you can't gain access to those keys, underneath you'll have the previous version of that data, which will then allow you to kind of roll that data back. And if that data has been deleted, you can also roll that data back again as well. Now, there's plenty of things to think about before just going and switching that versioning button on. And, that's my role as a storage SA, is to have that kind of conversation with customers and, make sure that feature is right for what they're looking to do and for the costs associated as well. We don't shy away from that, but just to kind of get off the mark and make sure if anything does happen to that active copy of the data, we're kind of there from the off, ready to revert back as quickly as possible. And also just looking about how we can handle multiple copies of the data as well. Potentially, there are requirements from regulators, there's requirements from compliance, there are requisites from compliance as well, and possibly even kind of at governmental or regional level, to have that data somewhere else in the event of something happens kind of catastrophic. Again, we don't want to think about worst case scenarios, but they are real, they are out there. And for that reason, we can copy data between AWS regions. So again, being in EMEA and, slightly biased, if you have your operations in London, you can copy that data like for like into Ireland, or you could send it to the Frankfurt region or Scandinavia. You could send it to Sydney if you wanted to. That's how AWS kind of brings that power of the cloud to customers, to be able to take that data and absolutely move it kind of byte for byte, bit for bit, cross region, across the globe, without having to go and build a data center. And that's kind of cool if you start to try and think about that at scale and how we protect that. So we can do that cross region and we can do that cross account. So even if the bad person does gain access to your your operational account, they do some nasty things to the data, we can have a totally separate account in a totally separate area of the world where that data is protected and replicated, which is absolutely kind of what we want. And just the kind of the final element on that, because it's on the slide as well, is that immutability aspect. So you kind of, your last bastion, your fallback position, look, we put everything in place, but the attackers, knew what they were doing. There were things that just happened completely out of our control. How do we make sure that that data is not going anywhere? And that's by turning on, in terms of S3, we have object locked, so that is worm. And I always have trouble saying this, so bear with me. Write once, read many. So that essentially enables you to have two modes, compliance mode and governance mode. Compliance mode means that not even the root user of that AWS account can delete that data. Governance mode means you need elevated permissions to delete that data, but essentially gives you a bit more flexibility with how you do it. And again, that just acts as that kind of, like I said, that kind of fallback position that, something has happened throughout the account. We really have to go back and just make sure that that data is not going anywhere. And just one kind of final note for me, because it's beginning to sound like a bit like an AWS sales pitch, is that if you do have file-based workloads, we also have just recently released SnapLock. So if you are familiar with NetApp, their worm capability as well has just been released on our Amazon FSx for NetApp ONTAP system. So you can actually take data from on-premise or between AWS or AWS and on-prem, wherever it might be, and actually have that data locked away. Again, something happens and you just need to kind of have that fallback position. It's a good place to go. So apologies, it didn't mean to sound like a sales pitch. I hope it actually came across with some of the features that we've got and services around that. But yeah, that's, like I said, that's how we're talking to customers, kind of going back to the original question, it's the hows, and, the technologies will come into play when we get there.
All good, Tom. Kyle, would you like to dig in a little bit to data loss prevention, auditing, and forensics?
I sure would. And actually, just as a very short aside before we get there, touching on something that Tom mentioned, there is a capability that I really want to highlight. First of all, Tom, congratulations on saying worm out loud, because you're braver than I am. But second of all, that whole architecture that you built up, right, starts with, a version, and then it has, as object versions on the source bucket, and then the concept of an air gap that's replicating into is equally important. With that object version, it's really important to understand not just, okay, here's which data was encrypted or which data was modified, but how do I actually recover from that data? Which pieces of data were affected, and then do I roll back or not? It's not like, an on-prem snapshot where you just bang, bang, revert the whole thing, right? In this case, you need granular understanding of this file was touched by a malicious user, this object was touched by a malicious user, this, whole prefix of objects remained untouched, and I don't need to act on them. So that's also, another key area where Superna integrates with native AWS functionality, right? S3 provides the versions, Superna provides the ability to understand how to roll back to various versions and can execute that in a recovery strategy. In terms of DLP, this is a kind of separate conversation. And like I mentioned before, ransomware is one category of nefarious activity that can happen. And for all of the protection that you can put against S3 data for immutability and air gap, an equally nefarious class of activity or signature, let's say, is if some of your data gets leaked. Now, you hear it all the time in the news, right? Corporation XYZ leaked, this particular subset of data to an unknown attacker. It's very common to receive a note in your email saying, hey, I am, malicious actor XYZ from, wherever, and I have exfiltrated some of your data, right? The first thing you need to know is, did that happen? So, of course, prevention is the new recovery. At Superna, let's look for that feature, let's look for that signature, and make sure that if there is data that's being exfiltrated that's abnormal, we highlight that particular activity. An example here I like to give, right, is an accountant can read certain objects in a bucket. That's normal behavior, right? For an accountant to go in and plug in a USB key and download all of the objects in a bucket, not normal behavior, right? So, you can draw a line between those two classes of operations. And you can know that if your data got leaked, your data might have gotten leaked. That said, there's no perfect way to detect data leak. The DLP prevention goes a long way towards understanding that and acting on that upfront. But it is totally possible for that same accountant to be just doing their normal job and to have their friend come over with like a camera and like take pictures of the data, right? And so then if you get the note in your email, hey, I have your user accounts, I have personable identifiable information from your customer base, how do you know if that's real or not, right? So then what you really have to do is understand, okay, this particular data was read at this particular time. It was read by this particular individual at this particular time. And you can go back then and reconstruct exactly what your threat and your exposure was, right? If you know what was read, then you can understand exactly how exposed you are. And really that information then guides your next steps in recovery. Either, you pay the ransom to keep it quiet, or you understand that this is just, an empty threat, that nobody actually did read this particular data. So it really gives you, the user, like the power to decide what your next steps are. And that is more powerful, I think, than almost anything, right? You understand exactly what happened and you understand what your exposure was. And only through those two pieces of information can you really identify what your actual risk or your actual exposure is.
Excellent. Let's see. So pretty much everybody is in a hybrid environment now. I mean, I think that's a given. I mean, there's nobody who's exclusively on-prem. There's nobody who's exclusively in the cloud. So, Tom, what would you say are some of the challenges that you would associate with these hybrid environments?
Yeah, good one. I would say it kind of depends where your starting position is. And what I mean by that is that we have a lot of conversations with customers where AWS is being seen as the destination for what we're calling a cloud-hosted data vault. And that means that usually there is some on-prem infrastructure that needs to be backed up. And, we've already talked about, what those data sets might be, how we make sure that we're narrowing those down to like a minimum viable business, moving that data in, etc. But then we also have customers who are exactly to your point, David. They have on-prem because that absolutely serves that need, and then they have some stuff in AWS because that absolutely serves that need. And we're not here to argue the whys and the wherefores around that. And so then the question comes up is, how do you then get the right balance between things that work well on-prem and things that work well in the cloud, but may not necessarily switch nicely? So what works well on-prem may not do necessarily what you want in the cloud, and we absolutely acknowledge vice versa, because not everything is 100% compatible across the board with everything you're looking to achieve. And so I think one of the challenges that we see with customers is that they need to want to make a choice where they actually can have tooling that facilitates both of those. And that's exactly why we're involved with Superna, because actually the tools that we're talking about here play just as good on-prem as they do inside of AWS. So actually being able to have that single pane of glass, that management point, to potentially take tools from Superna that are already on-prem and put those into AWS. I mean, from my point of view, that's an absolute win, because it kind of lowers the hurdles in terms of getting up and running. It stops that kind of administrative drag of potentially having to learn, new tools straight off the bat. I mean, the longer that we're kind of thinking about this, the longer the risk window is open. So therefore, if we have the tools, the processes, the training, the understanding, and the ability to just say, look, we have this today, can we go and use this tomorrow inside of AWS, or vice versa, depending on exactly how you want to do it, then yeah, I mean, that's just great for the customer all round, right? And we don't want to be forcing anyone to use any tools or doing anything they don't want to do. So that's what we kind of see with the hybrid environment model. And again, just to kind of state, there's no right or wrong around this about where anyone is sitting or what anyone is doing. Even though I'm from AWS, believe it or not, I'm not going to say everything needs to be in the cloud. We are absolutely expectant that the modern customer is thinking about where workloads, data, processes, etc., where best they fit, and what happens with all of that. And it's our job as solution architects to say, this is what we want to do. But in danger of waffling a little bit there, but just to kind of reiterate that and frame that, if customers are using solutions today that span the hybrid environment, let's continue to use them. I mean, it's just common sense, right? We're not reinventing the wheel here. It's not rocket science. Superna does a great job on-prem as it does inside of AWS. So yeah, why not continue along that vein? It's just the right thing to do.
Well, that gives us a perfect opportunity to dig into the cloud-hosted data vault and some of the components that are involved with that. So, Kyle, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Couldn't be like a more perfect segue, I think. And just to kind of touch on some things you built, right? There's 3 sort of required components in terms of actual tools that you need, and then a required reference architecture. And this reference architecture would be best practices guided by AWS on how to actually configure like a cloud hosted data vault, right? How to make sure that everything that's in there is secure and as impenetrable as possible. If you think about the required components, you need to start with on-prem protection of source data. You need to have protection-aware movement of data that can scale to the workloads that customers need it to. And you need in-vault protection and auditing of the data. And that in-vault component is especially important. You don't want to be reaching in to manage and audit your data. You need that to exist inside of the vault and autonomously alert out of the vault if anything happens. And so the next kind of 3 slides go through this architecture. I'd like to talk through them kind of a bit quickly because I do want to actually leave time for questions and open it up. But basically, when we start on-prem, we have some data sets, and we need those data sets to have ransomware protection on-prem. It makes no sense to take data that's compromised and copy that in. And if your data is being compromised and then copied into the vault, that's the worst case scenario because then you have to revert both. So absolutely protect your data at the source, right? Isolate it, make sure you have real-time detection. And then next, make sure that your copy engine that's actually moving that data to the cloud, which is, Dave on the next slide, kind of takes advantage of those informations, right? Your copy engine has to understand, is my source data clean? Can I copy this into the cloud? You need scale out copy. You need to be able to copy petabytes of data. You need incremental copies so that you're not making, individual copies all the time. And you have to take all of that information and feed it into S3. And in this case, we're considering just like, a sort of cloud hosted data vault, as we're calling it. That's an on-prem cluster that's copying into S3. But, as Tom alluded to before, there's all sorts of configurations you can do on the S3 side to further ensure that immutability, right? You can drop this into an S3 bucket and then put it into another account if you want to, using that native S3 replication. Totally good, right? The third piece of this is that you actually need protection inside of the vault, so that if your vault is compromised, then actually, right? And really, you need active protection of everything that's happening in there. You need auditing. You need to understand what's happening to the vault data so that if, the data gets encrypted, it gets stopped as fast as possible. If the data gets exfiltrated, you know exactly what was exfiltrated. And that happens both on-prem and in the cloud, and gives you this kind of unified threat protection wrapper around all of your data with data movement in between. And that's where, the cloud hosted data vault really, really shines and comes into play as kind of an architecture and a way forward for modern data centers.
Well, we got a couple of questions that have bubbled up here, so let's move over to the Q&A section. So one individual here has asked, is the AWS Vault something that is provided as a service by Superna? Well, no, it's not, but perhaps you can dig into that a little bit, Kyle or Tom. Take that one.
Sorry, David, actually, I just missed the first part of the question. Could you, the AWS?
Is the AWS Vault something that is provided as a service by Superna? Let's, draw the lines of who provides what and, yeah.
Right. So Superna, at this time, and has always dealt with customers being in charge of their own data, right? We don't offer this as a service. Superna offers actually the software and the tooling so that as you run this in your own environment being your on-prem solution and your own AWS accounts that it can be protected. The data remains within the bounds of your own organization, wherever that may be. So should you choose to be, co-locating your data in one region, should you choose a different region across the world for, protection or different cases, like, as Tom mentioned, right, maybe you're in London and you're choosing a data center in Sydney just so you can have it on the other side of the world in case, right? Those are all within the boundaries of an organization's sort of virtual cloud walls, if you will.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, Carl. So again, just kind of harking back to that conversation that we're having with the customers. We're at AWS and some of the work I've been doing with the financial services regulators. Now, of course, if you're not in financial services and you suddenly hear that, there's this kind of natural tendency to kind of tune out, because what do I care about what they're doing? But actually, the regulators in the financial service space are driving the discussion around what do cloud hosted data vaults look like, and what should those core tenants be, and what should you be thinking about, and what are the control mechanisms around that, and actually what is a data vault. And again, the way that we talk about it at AWS is each vault is going to be different, not only for each customer, but for also how they're potentially using applications as well. The same way that you may be using a database app, common database app may not be the same as how someone else is using it, as the same as the next person is using it. And so this is why we kind of refer to it as called core tenants. And I think one of those, again, I don't remember the name of the paper, so my apologies, but there is a Gartner report that says something along the lines of that if you have your data immutably protected and have tested a backup and restore, you are 90% of the way there of having the necessary protection to kind of survive some kind of cyber event. So the direct answer to your question is the AWS Vault something that's provided by Superna? Kyle's answered that. From an AWS perspective, we don't have something that you can go and deploy off the shelf, but what we do have are a set of tenants, a set of partners. You can see clearly that we work within this space because we appreciate it is absolutely a collective effort. There's absolutely no benefit from one person having an amazing cloud hosted data vault and someone having a less than amazing one, because the protection needs to be universal across the piece. So we're absolutely trying to bring all of those things forward to whoever we can, to make sure that everyone is protected, to make sure that we lower those risks and we prevent those attacks. So again, more than happy to kind of talk about that in a different session and what have you around that kind of core tenants of what protective looks like, if we want to. Sorry, David.
Excellent. A couple of other questions here. One is, how are customers looking to restore their environments? And I think that will go to you, Tom. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, almost again, absolutely depends where a customer starting point is. If we take a kind of common conversation, a common thread is I have on-premise, I have my operational environment. So I have good disaster recovery, good backup and restore, good business continuity, kind of in that operational day-to-day processing, kind of covered. So then when it comes to then how a customer's then looking to restore those environments, if the data, and when I say data, that's kind of encapsulating everything, right? That's machine images, that's databases, that is the application sets, that's Active Directory, that's the whole 9 yards inside of AWS. My kind of first question to a customer is, when it all goes south, if it all goes south, sorry, let me say that, if it all goes wrong, and we have to be in a position of complete recovery, I talked about that kind of ground zero, that extinction level event. If we're there, do we want to be thinking about moving data? Now, if it's sitting in AWS, do we want to be dragging that across a pipe? Because that takes time, right? It doesn't matter how you want to cook it, how you want to look at it. It's going to take time to get data from somewhere to somewhere. So my kind of default kind of easy answer to that question is why don't we restore it, kind of slightly biasly inside of AWS and get the organization up and running? Get the things moving, get the data flowing, get people doing what they need to do, and actually turn a recovery into a migration. Because actually at the point of migration, you've got everything's happening and you can sit down, kind of take a breath, figure out what went wrong during the cyber event, put all of those fixes in place and say, well, look, we've got all of the services up and running in our restore environment. That may be in AWS, but maybe we want them all back on-prem. Okay, absolutely. Why wouldn't you? That's where you started. That's potentially where you want to go back. But a restore at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're highly under pressure is a much different request than we're going to migrate these servers because we can time this, we can have the necessary conversations, we can make sure everyone's aligned when we want to do it. So yeah, recovery is an absolutely huge topic. It's one of the the top two things we talk to customers about. What are you going to back up and how are you going to recover it? The two kind of things go hand in hand.
All right. Another question has just come in. Question. I assume the ECAs are just spun up as EC2 instances. Does auto-scaling just automatically spin up more ECAs if Superna would require them?
That is such a fantastic question and like very insightful. So yes, actually. So it isn't an auto-scaling group. We've done the work to make the auto-scaling group lag aware. So auto-scaling groups can scale out based on load. Traditional metrics often are, CPU or RAM usage, and that we found actually wasn't the best metric for us. If you think about that architecture diagram, it works about the same as we have on-prem, right? We have Kafka topics and they're feeding ECA nodes. So the ECA nodes are independent and they're part of the scale set. And that scale set can grow based on the lag in the Kafka topics. So if the lag is starting to back up and we have certain thresholds, then the ECA scale set increases because clearly we need more compute capacity to handle the load that's coming in. And then as we're keeping up with the volume, if we're finding that there isn't so much work for the ECAs to do anymore, then we can collapse that. So that's really, it's so exciting, and it's a fundamental shift from the way that the software works on-prem, because now actually we do have full-on scaling of ECA cluster by actual measured load, and that's pretty exciting.
This has been a terrific discussion, and I hope we're going to be able to have an opportunity to continue. We're actually a little over time here, so we're not going to be able to field any additional questions, but rest assured that if we didn't get to yours, we'll be happy to reach out to you after the webinar. On behalf of myself, Kyle, and Tom, thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you found the material to be interesting and useful. And if you would like to contact any of us, our information will be here on the slide. Like I said, once the recording has finished loading to the cloud, we'll be able to send out the recording and the slide deck for reference. Again, if you'd like to contact any of us, we've included links to our respective LinkedIn profiles. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and do have a great rest of your day.